The day he found my daughter's drawing, everything changed. His eyes froze on the paper, then looked at me with a gaze that sent shivers down my spine. "Why does this child have my face?" he asked. I never thought a simple crayon drawing would turn our lives upside down. For years, I'd been raising my daughter alone, working 2 jobs just to keep a roof over our heads. We were invisible to the world of privilege and wealth. Until that fateful day when billionaire James Carter walked into the small bakery where I worked. My little Emma had been sitting in the corner, drawing as she always did while waiting for my shift to end. What happened next would change everything, though none of us were prepared for the truth that was about to surface. It was just another exhausting Friday at Sunshine Bakery. The kind where your feet ache, your smile feels painted on, and the clock seems frozen in time. I've been working double shifts all week, trying to save enough for Emma's asthma medication. She sat quietly in her usual corner, surrounded by her worn-out crayons and paper, her little escape from our harsh reality. The bell chimed, and in walked this man in a tailored suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Something about him seemed vaguely familiar, but in my tired state, I couldn't place it. He ordered a simple black coffee, nothing fancy, and then his eyes drifted to Emma. I noticed how he froze, staring at her with an intensity that made my protective instincts flare up instantly. "Beautiful child," he said, his voice carrying a weight I couldn't understand. He moved closer to Emma, and I tensed up, ready to intervene. But he just smiled at her drawing, a family portrait with a tall man who had distinctive blue eyes and a small birthmark near his temple. Emma looked up and smiled shyly, offering her artwork to this stranger without hesitation. When he took it, his hands trembled slightly. "Who is this man in your picture?" he asked her, pointing to the father figure. My heart pounded against my ribs as Emma replied innocently, "That's my daddy. I don't know him, but Mommy has his picture." The color drained from his face as he turned to look at me, recognition dawning in those familiar blue eyes. "This man looks exactly like me," he whispered just loud enough for me to hear. The bakery suddenly felt too small, too hot, too suffocating. Other customers faded into the background as our worlds collided in this unexpected moment. He studied my face with newfound interest, his brow furrowed in concentration. I could almost see the wheels turning in his mind, piecing together a puzzle I wasn't ready to explain. "What's your name?" he asked, though I had a feeling he already suspected the answer. I swallowed hard, knowing that whatever I said next would set something irreversible in motion. "Sarah. Sarah Mitchell," I managed to say, my voice barely audible over the espresso machine's hiss. His eyes widened slightly, confirming my suspicion that the name meant something to him. "Mitchell," he repeated, almost to himself. "Any relation to Catherine Mitchell from Westlake?" The mention of my mother's name and our hometown sent a jolt through my system. How could he possibly know? I nodded slowly, feeling as though the ground beneath me was shifting. He pulled out his business card, James Carter, CEO of Carter Innovations, and placed it on the counter between us. "I think we need to talk, Sarah. Would you and Emma be available tomorrow morning? I can send a car." The weight of 10 years of secrets and struggles pressed down on me as I stared at that embossed card. I barely slept that night, memories flooding back like a broken dam. 10 years ago, I'd been a bright-eyed college student working as a research assistant at a prestigious lab. That's where I'd met Robert, or at least that's the name he'd given me. We'd fallen for each other hard and fast, the kind of whirlwind romance that makes you blind to red flags. When I discovered I was pregnant, he vanished without a trace, leaving only a hollow apology note and some cash. I later learned from a sympathetic colleague that he'd been living under a false identity. He was actually James Carter, the heir to Carter Industries, conducting some kind of undercover research. By then, my pride and broken heart had built walls so high that I'd chosen to disappear rather than become some tabloid cautionary tale. The next morning, Emma was bubbling with excitement about riding in the fancy car that arrived precisely at 9 a.m. I, on the other hand, felt like I was walking to my own execution. The driver took us to a stunning penthouse overlooking the city, a world so removed from our tiny apartment that Emma's eyes nearly popped out of her head. James was waiting for us, looking considerably less polished than the day before. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he'd had a sleepless night too. He'd set out a spread of pastries and juice for Emma, who dove in with the uninhibited joy of a child who rarely saw such abundance. I had our lab run a preliminary DNA comparison based on probability markers from the photo you had in your wallet, he said quietly, getting straight to the point. I blinked in surprise. He'd noticed me checking the faded photo during a quiet moment at work. "You took my picture from my wallet?" I asked, anger flaring beneath my anxiety. He shook his head quickly, pulling out his phone to show me a discreet photo he'd taken of me looking at the old photograph. "I'm sorry for the invasion of privacy, but I needed to know. The preliminary results show a 98.7% probability that Emma is my daughter." The words hung in the air between us, finally spoken aloud after all these years. I watched his face carefully, bracing for accusations or legal threats. Instead, I saw something unexpected, tears forming in his eyes as he watched Emma happily drawing at the coffee table. "Why didn't you find me, Sarah? Why didn't you tell me?" The question wasn't angry. It was laced with genuine pain and confusion. "Find you? You disappeared completely," I hissed, keeping my voice low enough that Emma wouldn't hear. "And when I finally discovered who you really were, what was I supposed to do? Show up at your corporate headquarters with a baby and demand recognition? You were engaged to someone else within months." I couldn't keep the bitterness from seeping into my words. James flinched as though I'd slapped him. "That engagement was arranged by my father before he died. A business merger more than a marriage. It fell apart within a year." He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture so familiar it made my heart ache. "I'll look for you, Sarah. When I came to my senses about what I'd done, I tried to find you. You'd left school, changed your number. Your friend said you'd moved away without telling anyone where." The revelation staggered me. All these years, I'd believed he'd simply walked away without a second thought. We talked for hours while Emma played, unaware that her entire world was being rewritten around her. James explained how he'd been working undercover at the lab as part of a corporate espionage investigation, something his father had insisted on before handing over control of the company. I was young and arrogant, thinking I could play detective without consequences, he admitted, shame evident in his voice. "When I fell in love with you, everything became complicated. I knew I needed to tell you the truth, but then my father died suddenly, and I was thrust into running the company overnight. By the time I sorted through the chaos," he trailed off, his expression haunted by regret. "I found myself caught between a decade of hardened resentment and the undeniable sincerity in his eyes. She asks about you," I confessed, watching him visibly react to this information. "Not often, but sometimes. I've never said anything negative, just that you couldn't be with us, but that you would have loved her." It was true. Despite my pain, I'd never poisoned Emma against the father she'd never met. James looked at me with gratitude that made me uncomfortable. "Can I meet her properly?" As her father, he asked hesitantly. The question sent panic through me. This was all happening too fast. We'd gone from strangers to co-parents in the span of hours. "I don't think that's a good idea yet," I said firmly. "She's 9 years old. This isn't something we spring on her overnight. We need time." To my relief, he nodded in understanding, though the disappointment in his eyes was palpable. "I've missed everything," he said quietly, almost to himself. "First steps, first words, first day of school." The raw pain in his voice made something in my chest twist uncomfortably. For years, I'd imagined him as callous and uncaring. It was easier that way. Seeing him vulnerable disrupted the narrative I'd constructed to make our situation bearable. "She's still young," I found myself saying, surprised by my own attempt to comfort him. "There's a lot more first to come." He smiled weakly at that, then reached for a folder on the side table. "I want to help support you both. No strings attached." My defenses immediately went up. I'd been independent for so long that the offer felt like an insult. "We've managed just fine without your money," I said stiffly. James looked around our modest clothing and at Emma's worn-out shoes before responding gently. "Have you, though?" You're working 2 jobs, Sarah. Emma deserves to have her mother present, not exhausted. The truth in his words stung. This isn't about charity or buying my way into her life, he continued. It's about taking responsibility for my actions and giving Emma the opportunities she deserves. He slid the folder toward me. Just think about it. For her sake. I left that meeting with my mind spinning, the folder untouched in my bag. As we rode back to our apartment in the same luxury car that had picked us up, Emma chatted excitedly about the nice man with eyes like hers. He draws like me too, Mommy, she exclaimed. And he said he'd teach me how to make a real building someday. I realized then that while James and I had been careful with our words, children have an intuition that often sees truth before adults are ready to acknowledge it. 3 days passed without contact from James. I'd almost convinced myself the whole encounter had been some elaborate dream when a text message arrived from an unknown number. No pressure. Just checking in. JC. Attached was a photo of a half-finished architectural sketch that mirrored Emma's drawing style eerily. Something about that simple gesture, showing me how similar they truly were, broke through another layer of my defenses. I found myself replying with a recent picture of Emma at her school science fair, where she'd built a solar system model that won first place. His response came quickly. She's brilliant. Just like her mother. The compliment warmed me despite my best efforts to remain detached. We began a cautious text exchange over the next few weeks. I'd send updates about Emma's day. He'd respond with thoughtful questions or share random facts that reminded him of her. Slowly, a fragile bridge formed between our separate worlds. I learned that behind the billionaire facade was a man who worked too much, slept too little, and harbored a passion for astronomy. Another trait Emma had mysteriously inherited. One evening, while Emma was at a friend's birthday sleepover, I finally opened the folder he'd given me. Inside wasn't a check or legal documents as I'd feared, but a comprehensive education fund for Emma and a modest house in a good school district, already purchased and placed in trust for her. The gesture was thoughtful rather than flashy, security rather than luxury. When I called him, voice shaking with a mixture of gratitude and lingering suspicion, his response disarmed me completely. I don't want to buy your forgiveness, Sarah. I just want to sleep at night, knowing she'll never worry about having a roof over her head or wonder if she can afford college. There was no smugness, no self-congratulation, just the raw vulnerability of a father trying to make amends. Why a house and not just money? I asked, genuinely curious about the specific choice. His answer revealed more about him than perhaps he intended. Because growing up in hotels and temporary residences while my father built his empire was the loneliest part of my childhood. Every kid deserves a place where memories can build up in the walls. 2 months after that bakery encounter, we agreed it was time to introduce James to Emma properly. We decided on a casual day at the Science Museum, neutral territory where Emma would be comfortable and engaged. I prepared her gently, explaining that the nice man from the bakery was actually someone very special who wanted to know her better. Children are remarkably adaptable, but I still worried about how she'd process this monumental shift in her understanding of family. The morning of our museum date, Emma bounced around our apartment with nervous energy, changing outfits 3 times and practicing what she might say. I watched her with a mixture of anxiety and hope, wondering if I was making the right decision or setting her up for potential heartbreak. When James arrived, carrying a small, gift-wrapped package and wearing jeans instead of his usual suit, Emma hid behind me briefly before her curiosity overpowered her shyness. "Is that for me?" she asked, eyeing the package in his hands. James knelt down to her level, a gesture that immediately earned him points in my book. "It is," he said gently. "I heard you like the stars." She unwrapped it carefully to reveal a professional-grade telescope, compact but powerful. Her eyes widened in wonder. "How did you know?" she whispered. James glanced at me before answering. Sometimes people who are connected can like the same things without even knowing it. I held my breath, waiting for Emma's reaction to this subtle hint. She studied his face intently, then looked at me with a question in her eyes that I answered with a small nod. What happened next would remain etched in my memory forever. Without prompting, Emma reached out and touched the small birthmark near James's temple. the same mark she'd drawn on the daddy in her picture. I have one too, she said softly, pulling back her hair to reveal an identical mark near her own temple. A detail I'd always attributed to coincidence, but now seemed like the universe's way of signing its work. James's eyes filled with tears as he struggled to maintain composure. "Yes, you do," he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. The museum faded into the background as this pivotal moment unfolded between father and daughter. Emma, with the straightforward courage that only children possess, asked the question that had been building. "Are you my real daddy? The one from my pictures?" James looked to me for guidance, unwilling to overstep. I nodded slightly, giving him permission to speak his truth. "Yes, Emma, I am," he said simply, "and not knowing you has been the biggest mistake of my life." I expected tears or confusion from Emma, but instead, she responded with the resilience that had gotten us through so many difficult years. "That's okay. You're here now." And then she took his hand as naturally as if she'd been doing it her whole life. "Can you show me how to use my telescope tonight? Mommy says we can see Jupiter if we try hard enough." In that moment, I saw James transform from nervous billionaire to simply dad, his entire focus narrowing to this child who had accepted him without reservation. The day unfolded with a strange new harmony. Emma darted between us, sharing her discoveries and asking James countless questions about everything from dinosaurs to distant planets. I watched them together, noting the similar mannerisms, the matching enthusiasm for scientific exhibits, the identical way they tilted their heads when concentrating. Nature had left its signature all over their connection, undeniable to anyone who saw them together. During a quiet moment while Emma explored an interactive display, James whispered, "Thank you for this. For raising her to be so incredible. For giving me a chance I don't deserve." The sincerity in his voice reached parts of me I'd thought long closed off. "She deserves to know her father," I replied, surprising myself with how easily the words came. That evening, the three of us gathered on the rooftop of James's building with Emma's new telescope. The city lights created less than ideal viewing conditions, but Emma's excitement couldn't be dimmed. James patiently showed her how to adjust the settings, his hands guiding hers with gentle precision. "Look, Mommy, I can see Jupiter's stripes," she called out, beckoning me to take a turn. As I leaned toward the eyepiece, I felt James's presence beside me, steady and unassuming. Our eyes met briefly over Emma's head, and something unspoken passed between us. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. Later, as Emma finally succumbed to exhaustion, falling asleep on the ride home, James asked softly, "Where do we go from here, Sarah?" It was the question I'd been asking myself for weeks, with no clear answer in sight. The weeks that followed brought a new rhythm to our lives. James would visit Emma twice a week, always calling ahead, always respectful of boundaries. He never pushed for more than I was willing to give, which gradually allowed me to lower my guard. One evening, after Emma had fallen asleep following an exciting day at the aquarium with her father, James lingered at our apartment door. "I've been thinking about something," he said hesitantly. "The company is opening a new research division focusing on sustainable energy. Your background in environmental science would make you perfect for the team." I immediately stiffened, suspecting charity disguised as opportunity. Reading my expression accurately, he quickly added, "The director doesn't report to me. You'd be evaluated on merit alone. I just thought you might be tired of smelling like cinnamon rolls every day." Despite my reservations, I agreed to interview for the position. To James's credit, he removed himself entirely from the process, even arranging for the interview to be conducted under my maiden name to avoid any hint of nepotism. When I was offered the job 2 weeks later, the satisfaction of earning it on my own merits was sweetened by the knowledge that I could finally provide Emma with stability without working myself to exhaustion. The transition wasn't without complications. Explaining to Emma why her world was changing so rapidly required constant reassurance and patience from both James and me. "Does this mean we're going to be a regular family now?" she asked one night as I tucked her into bed. The innocent question carried weight beyond her understanding. We're going to be our own special kind of family, I answered carefully. Sometimes families don't all live together, but still care about each other very much. It was the truth, as I understood it then. James and our co-parents, nothing more. The hurt and betrayal of the past couldn't simply vanish because he had re-entered our lives with good intentions. Yet something was shifting between us, slowly and almost imperceptibly. Working in the same company, though in different buildings, we occasionally crossed paths in the corporate cafeteria or at company events. Each encounter revealed another layer of the man he had become: thoughtful, hard-working, and surprisingly humble despite his position. The arrogant young man who had broken my heart seemed to have been replaced by someone I might actually respect. 6 months after that fateful day at the bakery, James invited Emma and me to his family's lake house for a weekend. No pressure, he assured me. Separate rooms, plenty of space. Emma mentioned wanting to try canoeing, and the lake is perfect for beginners. I hesitated, aware that this represented crossing another boundary in our carefully constructed arrangement. But Emma's pleading eyes wore down my resistance, and I found myself packing weekend bags for both of us. The lake house turned out to be a modest cabin rather than the luxury mansion I'd expected. Weathered wood, comfortable furniture, and walls lined with books and old photographs. This was my grandmother's place, James explained as he showed us around. The only part of my childhood that felt normal. I caught a glimpse of a different history than I'd imagined for him. Not all privilege and entitlement. That weekend marked a turning point. Away from the pressures of work and routine, with Emma happily exploring the shoreline and collecting rocks, James and I finally had conversations that went beyond co-parenting logistics. Sitting on the dock at sunset, mugs of hot chocolate warming our hands against the evening chill, he told me about his father's ruthless business tactics and the impossible standards he'd grown up trying to meet. I was terrified of becoming him, he admitted, staring out at the water. The day I found out you were pregnant, I panicked. I convinced myself you and the baby would be better off without me and my family's toxic legacy. It wasn't an excuse, and he didn't offer it as one. Just context for actions that had shaped all our lives. In return, I shared my own journey, the terror of facing pregnancy alone, the struggle to finish my degree with a newborn, the string of jobs that barely kept us afloat. The hardest part wasn't the poverty, I confessed. It was watching other children with their fathers and not being able to give Emma that. James listened without interrupting, absorbing each detail with a quiet intensity that made me feel truly heard perhaps for the first time. When Emma called for us to watch her skip stones across the lake's smooth surface, we both rose and walked toward her together. Not quite a united front, but no longer adversaries either. That night, after tucking Emma into the small loft bedroom, I found James sitting by the fireplace, studying an old photo album. "This is the only picture I have of my mother," he said, pointing to a faded photograph of a young woman with the same blue eyes. "She died when I was 4. Cancer." The revelation caught me off guard. In all our conversations, he'd never mentioned his mother. My father remarried within a year. My stepmother was efficient. Not cruel, just attached. The pieces of James's past began forming a clearer picture, explaining behaviors I'd previously attributed to selfishness. "Is that why you built that ridiculous telescope network?" I asked, referring to the astronomy project his company had funded in remote locations around the world. He looked surprised that I knew about it. "My mother loved the stars," he said simply. "It feels like the only way I can still connect with her." By Sunday evening, when we packed up to return to the city, something fundamental had shifted. Emma had taken to calling James Dad with an ease that sometimes caught us both by surprise. More surprisingly, I found myself enjoying his company, his dry humor, his thoughtful questions, his genuine interest in both our lives. During the drive home, with Emma asleep in the back seat, James cleared his throat nervously. "I know this might be premature, but I've been thinking about Emma's schooling. The waitlist for Westridge Academy is nearly 2 years long, but they have an opening for fall semester. I took the liberty of scheduling a tour next week. For both of you, of course. Westridge was the most prestigious private school in the city, known for its science and arts programs. It was also completely out of reach financially for most families. James, we've talked about this, I said firmly, though keeping my voice low to avoid waking Emma. No special treatment. No pulling strings. She needs to grow up understanding the value of earning her place. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, clearly having anticipated this reaction. This isn't about buying her way in, Sarah. They have a scholarship program specifically for gifted children in STEM. Given her test scores and science fair projects, she's exactly the kind of student they're looking for. All I did was get you an interview slot. The clarification diffused some of my indignation, but not all. And you didn't think to discuss this with me first? I challenged. His expression was genuinely contrite as he admitted, I knew you might say no without exploring the opportunity. I just want her to have options we didn't have. The school was indeed impressive. Small class sizes, state-of-the-art laboratories, and a curriculum that would challenge Emma's bright mind. Despite my reservations about disrupting her life yet again, I couldn't deny that this represented an opportunity I'd never be able to provide on my own. When Emma aced the entrance assessment and was offered a full scholarship, my remaining objections crumbled in the face of her excitement. Can you believe it, Mommy? They have a real electron microscope and a robotics team. Her enthusiasm was infectious, making it impossible to stand on principle when her future was at stake. James, to his credit, remained in the background during the entire process, careful not to push his advantage or claim credit for opening the door. As Emma settled into her new school, thriving in ways I hadn't imagined possible, my relationship with James continued to evolve. We found ourselves texting not just about Emma, but about our days, sharing small victories and frustrations. When I was promoted to team lead at the research division, he sent flowers to my office with a simple note, earned, not given. Congratulations. The gesture meant more than he could know, acknowledgement that I was making my own way, not riding on his coattails. One evening, after a parent-teacher conference we'd both attended, James suggested dinner at a small Italian restaurant near my apartment. Just to discuss Emma's science project, he clarified quickly, perhaps sensing my hesitation. Over pasta and wine. Our conversation drifted far beyond Emma's education to our own aspirations and regrets. I never wanted the corner office, you know, he confessed, spinning his wine glass thoughtfully. I wanted to design sustainable buildings, create spaces that would last generations while healing the planet. My father called it a hippie pipe dream. The vulnerability in his admission resonated with my own abandoned dreams of environmental research. It's not too late, I found myself saying. You run the company now. Who's stopping you? He looked at me with something like wonder. You know, for someone who couldn't stand the sight of me a year ago, you give surprisingly good advice. We both laughed, the sound warm and genuine in the candlelit space between us. As he drove me home, a comfortable silence settled between us, the kind that exists only when two people have moved beyond the need to fill every moment with words. 18 months after our reunion, Emma's annual school talent show presented an unexpected turning point. She had insisted on performing a piano and violin duet, but refused to tell us who her partner would be. It's a surprise, was all she would say, her eyes twinkling with mischief. On the night of the performance, I sat in the auditorium, scanning the program for clues. When Emma walked onto the stage in her blue dress, followed by James in a matching blue tie, violin in hand, my breath caught in my throat. I had no idea he played, just one of the many details about him I was still discovering. They performed Pachelbel's canon flawlessly, Emma's small fingers dancing across the piano keys, while James's violin sang in perfect harmony. The metaphor wasn't lost on me. Two separate melodies creating something beautiful together. Backstage afterward, Emma was bubbling with excitement. Did you see Mom's face when you came out, Dad? She had no idea. They shared a conspiratorial laugh that warmed rather than excluded me. How long have you two been planning this? I asked, genuinely impressed by their secrecy. Since you mentioned at dinner that music was your first love, Emma replied innocently. Dad said he wanted to hear you talk about music more, so we thought this might remind you how much you love it. The casual revelation that they discussed me thought about my happiness caught me off guard. James met my eyes over Emma's head, a question in his gaze that I wasn't quite ready to answer. That night, after putting an exhausted Emma to bed, I found James lingering in the living room of what was now our home, the house he'd purchased for Emma's trust, which I'd eventually agreed to move into for her sake. "She's remarkable," he said softly, looking at the family photos that now adorned the walls, a visual timeline of our unconventional journey. "She gets that from you," I replied automatically. He shook his head, moving closer. "She gets her resilience from you. Her ability to forgive. That's all you two." The compliment settled somewhere deep in my chest, acknowledging something I rarely gave myself credit for. "I think that might be her own special magic," I countered. "Children have an incredible capacity for love when we don't teach them to hold grudges." James took a step closer, close enough that I could smell the faint cedar notes of his cologne. "And what about their mothers? Do they have the same capacity?" The question hung between us, loaded with unspoken meaning. For 18 months, we'd been rebuilding trust brick by brick, co-parenting, developing friendship, slowly healing old wounds. But we carefully avoided addressing the lingering tension that sometimes surfaced when our hands accidentally touched or our eyes held for a moment too long. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "Forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting." He nodded, accepting the boundary without pushing. "I'm not asking you to forget, Sarah. I'm just hoping there might be room for something new alongside the old memories." As he turned to leave, I found myself reaching for his hand, a gesture so simple yet loaded with significance. "Stay," I said quietly, surprising myself as much as him. "It's late, and Emma will want to have breakfast with you tomorrow." It was a practical excuse for an emotional decision, but James accepted it with a simple nod. "I'll take the couch," he offered, another small gesture of respect that continued to redefine my understanding of him. That night, lying awake in my room, I found myself replaying our journey, from the passionate young couple we'd been, through the years of absence and struggle, to this new undefined territory we now navigated. The anger that had once burned so brightly had gradually transformed into something else entirely, a cautious appreciation for the man James had become, and perhaps always had the potential to be. Morning arrived with the sound of laughter from the kitchen. I found Emma and James making what appeared to be experimental pancakes, flour dusting both their faces. "Mom, Dad's teaching me how to make Grandma Carter's special recipe, but we kind of made a mess," Emma announced with more pride than contrition. James shot me an apologetic look, though his eyes held a spark of something deeper. "I promised to clean up before leaving," he assured me. The domestic scene struck me with unexpected force. This could have been our life all along in another version of our story. I pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the present moment. "I'll help," I offered, rolling up my sleeves to join their culinary adventure. The three of us moved around the kitchen with surprising coordination, as if we'd been doing this dance for years rather than months. When Emma accidentally splashed batter onto James's expensive watch, I braced for irritation that never came. Instead, he laughed and dabbed a spot of batter on her nose in retaliation. These small moments accumulated over the following weeks, James staying for dinner more often, joining us for weekend outings, becoming a fixture rather than a visitor in our lives. Emma flourished in the warmth of our evolving family unit, her confidence growing as her world stabilized. One evening, after she'd gone to bed, James and I sat on the porch swing, watching fireflies illuminate the summer darkness. "I have something to show you," he said, pulling out his phone. "Remember that sustainable building division I always wanted to create? The board approved it yesterday." His excitement was contagious as he scrolled through renderings of eco-friendly structures designed to work with nature rather than against it. "They're beautiful," I said sincerely, genuinely happy for this fulfillment of his long-deferred dream. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said, his voice low and earnest. "Your persistence, your refusal to accept anything less than authentic change. It made me brave enough to finally stand up to the board." The compliment caught me off guard. "I didn't do anything," I protested. He shook his head, turning to face me fully. You showed me what courage looks like every day for 10 years, raising our daughter alone, never compromising your values, even when it would have been easier. Watching you changed me, Sarah." The intensity in his eyes made my heart race as he continued. "I know we can't rewrite the past, but I'm hoping you might consider writing the future with me." From his pocket, he pulled not a ring as I momentarily feared, but a key. "The lake house. I put it in all our names, yours, mine, and Emma's. No strings, no pressure. Just a place that could belong to all of us, however you want to define that." The key rested in my palm, heavy with symbolism beyond its metal weight. It represented a choice: to fully embrace this reconstructed family or to maintain the careful boundaries I'd established for self-protection. "This is a big step," I said finally, needing him to understand the magnitude of what he was suggesting. James nodded, his expression solemn. "I know, and we don't have to decide anything tonight. I just wanted you to know that I'm all in, Sarah, whatever all in means for us." He wasn't pushing for romantic reconciliation or attempting to erase our complicated history. He was simply opening a door and inviting me to step through if and when I was ready. The thoughtfulness of the gesture, so different from the impulsive actions of his younger self, gave me pause. We spent that summer making weekend trips to the lake house, creating new memories alongside the ghosts of what might have been. Emma thrived in the freedom of nature, learning to canoe, identifying bird species, and developing a collection of interesting rocks that threatened to overtake her bedroom. James and I established an easy rhythm. He would cook breakfast while I prepared lunch. I would help Emma with her summer reading while he repaired the dock or cleared trails through the surrounding woods. The boundaries between us blurred in this neutral territory, allowing glimpses of what partnership rather than just co-parenting might feel like. One stormy evening, with rain lashing against the windows and Emma long asleep, James built a fire in the stone hearth and poured 2 glasses of wine. "Do you remember that research conference in Boston?" he asked unexpectedly. "The one where we snuck away from the closing reception and ended up watching the sunrise from that rooftop bar?" I smiled despite myself. It had been one of those perfect moments that had defined our early relationship before complications and deceptions entered the picture. "We talked about changing the world," I recalled softly. "You were going to revolutionize urban architecture, and I was going to save the coastal wetlands." He nodded, his expression wistful. We were so young, so certain. The unspoken question hung between us. What would have happened if he'd been honest from the beginning? If we'd faced his family and responsibilities together? The weight of a decade of parallel lives pressed into the silence. I used to imagine alternate versions of our story, I admitted, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. "In some of them, you told me the truth that day, and we figured it out together. In others, I found you years later when Emma was older, and we had this dramatic confrontation with lawyers and custody battles." James winced slightly at the latter scenario, though we both knew it could easily have been our reality. "What about now?" he asked carefully. "What version are we living?" It was a profound question that deserved an honest answer. I took a sip of wine, gathering my thoughts before responding. "I think we're writing a new version entirely," I said. "One where we acknowledge the mistakes, but don't let them define our future." The relief in his eyes was palpable. Slowly, he reached across the space between us and took my hand, a simple gesture that somehow carried more weight than any passionate embrace could have. "I never stopped loving you, Sarah," he confessed, his voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "Even when I convinced myself I was doing the right thing by staying away." The words hung in the air between us, neither rejected nor immediately embraced. Instead of rushing to respond, I squeezed his hand, acknowledging the truth without promising more than I was ready to give. Morning broke with a clarity that seemed to mirror my own thoughts. As I watched Emma and James skipping stones across the lake's glassy surface, their matching profiles silhouetted against the rising sun, something settled in my heart. The path forward wasn't about forgetting the past or pretending the hurt hadn't happened. It was about choosing joy in the present despite it all. When James caught me watching them, his smile held a question I was finally ready to answer. That evening, After Emma had fallen asleep, counting fireflies from her bedroom window, I joined James on the dock where he sat gazing at the stars. Without a word, I sat beside him and rested my head on his shoulder, a silent acceptance of all that had been and all that might still be. What followed was a gradual thawing rather than a dramatic reconciliation. Back in the city, our carefully separated lives began to intertwine in small but significant ways. James kept a change of clothes at our house. I gained keycard access to his penthouse. Emma stopped asking when Dad would be visiting because his presence became a regular fixture in our daily routines. The evolution was organic, unforced, healing happening in its own time rather than according to some prescribed schedule. By the time Emma's 10th birthday approached, the three of us functioned as a unit, though James and I had yet to define exactly what that meant for us beyond co-parenting. Emma's birthday party was scheduled at the Science Museum where James had first officially met her as her father. The symmetry wasn't lost on any of us, a full-circle moment marking how far we'd come. I was putting final touches on our cake when James arrived early, carrying not just Emma's gift but a small box for me as well. "It's not what you think," he said quickly, noticing my wary expression. "Just open it when you have a moment." I set it aside, focusing on the celebration ahead, though curiosity niggled at the back of my mind throughout the bustling party. Emma was radiant, surrounded by friends from her new school and delighted by the interactive exhibits James had arranged to have opened specially for her guests. Later, after the last guest had departed and Emma was examining her presents with contented exhaustion, I finally opened the small box James had given me. Inside wasn't jewelry as I'd half feared, but a USB drive and a folded note. "What's this?" I asked, genuinely puzzled. James looked unusually nervous, running a hand through his hair in that familiar gesture I'd come to recognize as his tell for emotional significance. "It's everything," he said simply. "Every email I drafted to you, but never sent. Every attempt to find you. Every legal document I filed trying to trace you after you disappeared. I thought you should have the whole truth, not just my version of it." The weight of what he was offering, complete transparency, vulnerability without expectation, left me momentarily speechless. That night, after Emma was asleep and James had gone back to his penthouse, giving me space to process his gift without pressure, I plugged the drive into my laptop. What unfolded before me was a digital archive of a decade of regret. Dozens of unsent messages ranging from desperate apologies to mundane updates about his life. Private investigator reports that had gone cold when I changed my name. Journal entries chronicling his struggle between respecting what he believed was my choice to disappear and his growing certainty that he'd made a terrible mistake. The timestamps told a story of their own. Consistent efforts spanning years rather than a convenient narrative constructed after the fact. I read until dawn, absorbing this alternate timeline that had run parallel to my own struggle. When morning came, I called him, voice hoarse from unshed tears. "Why did you keep looking if you thought I'd chosen to vanish?" It was the question that burned brightest among many. His answer was immediate, as if he'd been waiting for this specific inquiry. "Because walking away from you was the biggest mistake of my life, and I couldn't believe you'd make the same mistake unless there was more to the story. I kept hoping I was wrong about you choosing to disappear." The irony was almost painful. Both of us suffering separately, each believing the other had moved on without a backward glance. "Can we talk? In person?" I asked. His relief was audible as he promised to be there within the hour. When he arrived, coffee in hand and uncertainty in his eyes, I opened the door wider than necessary, a small invitation containing multitudes. "I want to try," I said simply as we sat at the kitchen table, steam rising from untouched mugs between us. No elaborate speeches or conditions, just an honest acknowledgement that whatever was still between us deserved exploration. James's expression shifted from cautious hope to something deeper, more profound. "I've been ready for 10 years, he replied, then quickly added, "but we'll go at your pace. No pressure." The promise meant everything. This older, wiser version of James understood that trust, once broken, needed gentle handling during reconstruction. We agreed to take things slowly, to prioritize Emma's stability above all else, and to be honest about our feelings as they evolved. It wasn't the passionate reunion of a romance novel, but something potentially more lasting, a thoughtful choice made with open eyes. Our first official date was laughably ordinary. Dinner at a neighborhood restaurant where neither of us had to pretend to be anything other than who we were. No luxury settings designed to impress, no elaborate gestures to compensate for lost time. Just two people with shared history and tentative hope, rediscovering conversation without the buffer of co-parenting logistics. Is this weird? I asked halfway through the meal, acknowledging the surreal quality of dating a man who was simultaneously my greatest heartbreak and the father of my child. James considered the question seriously before answering. Less weird than pretending we don't feel anything beyond Emma. His honesty was refreshing, one of the many qualities I was learning to appreciate in this adult version of the man I'd once loved. We settled into a careful rhythm over the following months. Family time with Emma, occasional evenings, just the two of us, gradually rebuilding what had been lost while creating something new. There were awkward moments and difficult conversations, particularly when James finally introduced me to his corporate world at a company gala. Whispers followed us across the ballroom. Speculation about the mysterious woman and child who had suddenly appeared in the CEO's life after years of confirmed bachelorhood. "Ignore them," James murmured, his hand steady at the small of my back. "They'll find something else to gossip about next week." His prioritization of our comfort over public opinion spoke volumes about his change values. Later that evening, he surprised me by announcing a substantial company donation to a scholarship fund for single parents pursuing science education, a gesture that acknowledged my journey without exploiting it for publicity. 1 year after that pivotal day in the bakery, James suggested we take Emma back to the lake house for the anniversary. Not to commemorate anything sad, he clarified, but to mark how far we've come. The idea resonated. A chance to consciously acknowledge our unusual path while celebrating where it had led us. The weekend unfolded with a natural ease that would have seemed impossible 12 months earlier. We hiked forest trails, made s'mores around a campfire, and played board games during an unexpected rainstorm. Watching Emma beat us both at Scrabble, her confidence and security evident in her easy laughter, I felt a profound gratitude for this imperfect journey that had somehow led to something beautiful. That night, after Emma had drifted asleep, James and I sat on the porch swing, a comfortable silence between us that required no filling. "I have something for you," James said eventually, reaching into his pocket. "It's not a ring," he added quickly, perhaps remembering my previous reaction to symbolic gestures. "Not yet, anyway. That's entirely up to you, and only when if you're ever ready." What he placed in my palm was a small compass, antique brass with delicate etching around its face. "It belonged to my grandmother," he explained. "She gave it to me when I went off to college, so it would help me find my way home if I ever got lost." The sentiment behind the gift moved me deeply. Acknowledgement of our separate journeys that had somehow, against all odds, led back to each other. "Thank you," I whispered, understanding that he was offering not just a family heirloom, but a symbol of faith in our shared future. As the second year of our reunion approached, we faced a new challenge. James's company was opening an international headquarters in Singapore, requiring his presence for several months to oversee the transition. "I'll turn it down," he said immediately when the board made the proposal. "Emma's stability comes first." His instinctive prioritization of our family touched me, but I found myself considering alternatives rather than automatic rejection. "What if we came with you?" I suggested, "just for part of the time. Emma's school has that 2-week break coming up, and my team could manage remotely for a bit." The idea of temporarily stepping outside our carefully constructed routine felt both terrifying and exhilarating, a test of our newly rebuilt foundation. The Singapore trip became a pivotal experience for all of us. Emma thrived in the exposure to a new culture, absorbing Mandarin phrases with remarkable ease and developing a passion for the city's phenomenal gardens. I found unexpected professional connections through James's network, leading to a collaborative research project on urban sustainability that reignited my academic interests. And James, watching him operate in his element while still prioritizing family dinners and weekend explorations revealed yet another dimension of the man he had become. One evening, as we stood on the hotel balcony overlooking the spectacular skyline, he wrapped his arms around me from behind and rested his chin on my shoulder. "Thank you for taking this chance," he said softly, "for believing we could be more than our mistakes." The intimacy between us had been rebuilding gradually, tentative touches growing more confident, conversations extending deeper into the night, shared glances carrying meaning beyond words. In Singapore, away from the weight of our past and the watchful eyes of those who knew our story, something shifted. The walls I'd maintained for self-protection began to feel less necessary, more like obstacles to potential happiness. One night, after Emma had fallen asleep in the adjoining hotel room, I turned to James with a decision in my eyes that needed no verbal explanation. Our reconnection was both familiar and entirely new. The muscle memory of bodies that had once known each other intimately combined with the reverent appreciation of what had almost been lost forever. Afterward, lying in the quiet darkness with city lights painting patterns across the ceiling, James traced patterns on my shoulder and asked, "Where do we go from here, Sarah?" It was the same question he'd asked that first night after the museum, but now it carried different weight. We returned from Singapore with more than souvenirs and photographs. We carried a newfound certainty about the future we wanted to build together. The transition was subtle rather than dramatic. James began staying overnight more regularly, his belongings gradually migrating into closet space I cleared without announcement. Emma, perceptive as always, noticed the shift but seemed unsurprised, as if this evolution had been inevitable from her perspective all along. "Are we a forever family now?" she asked one morning over breakfast, the directness of her question catching us both off guard. James and I exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between us before he answered carefully, "We've always been a family, Bug. The shape just looked a little different now." Her satisfied nod suggested this was exactly the answer she'd been hoping for. The question of marriage hovered unspoken between us for several months. Neither of us felt rushed. We learned the hard way that foundations matter more than facades. When the subject finally arose, it emerged naturally during a mundane Sunday afternoon. Emma was at a friend's birthday party, and we were sorting through old photographs for a school project she needed to complete. James paused over an image of Emma as a toddler, her chubby hands clutching a toy microphone as she performed for an unseen audience. "I wish I'd been there," he said softly, the familiar regret coloring his words. Without thinking, I responded, "You'll be there for everything else." The promise hung in the air between us, its significance settling into the quiet room. James set down the photograph carefully before turning to face me fully. "Is that what you want?" he asked, his voice steady despite the weight of the question. "Everything else?" With me, there was no dramatic dropping to one knee, no elaborate speech, just the honest question of a man who had learned that truth matters more than grand gestures. I consider my answer not out of uncertainty, but out of respect for the moment's importance. "Yes," I replied simply. "Not because of Emma, not because of the past, but because of who we are now." His smile then, a slow, wondering expression of joy, is something I'll carry with me always. He reached for my hand, entwining our fingers with deliberate care. "Then let's do everything else together," he said. The proposal was as unconventional as our journey, which seemed entirely fitting. We decided to tell Emma together, uncertain how she would receive news that would formalize what had already become our daily reality. Her reaction surprised us both, not with the excitement we'd anticipated, but with practical concerns that revealed how deeply she'd thought about our unusual family structure. "Will my name change?" she asked first, followed quickly by, "Where will we live? And does this mean I'll get brothers or sisters?" The barrage of questions made us laugh, even as we recognized the legitimate need for reassurance behind them. "One step at a time, Bug," James answered, pulling her into a family hug that somehow felt both brand new and comfortingly familiar. As she nestled between us, secure in the knowledge that her world was expanding rather than shifting beneath her feet, I caught James's eye over her head. The journey that had brought us here, with all its detours, heartaches, and unexpected turns, suddenly seemed less like a cautionary tale and more like the foundation of strength for everything still to come. What a journey we've witnessed together. This story of reconnection and forgiveness reminds us that sometimes life's greatest challenges lead to our most profound blessings. The path Sarah and James traveled wasn't easy, filled with misunderstandings, pain, and lost years. But their ability to move forward for Emma's sake opened the door to healing and new possibilities. Does your life contain broken relationships that might deserve a second chance? Not all connections can or should be rebuilt, but what might happen if you approached a past hurt with fresh eyes? Sometimes the most powerful transformations begin with a simple conversation, an admission of wrong, or the courage to listen to another perspective. Have you ever experienced a moment where your entire understanding of your past suddenly shifted? Like Sarah discovering James had been searching for her all along. Sometimes a single piece of information can rewrite our entire narrative. Where in your life might you be missing crucial context that could change everything? The courage to be vulnerable, to admit mistakes, and to prioritize healing over pride. These are the true markers of strength that this story celebrates. If you've been touched by this journey of family, forgiveness, and second chances, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Has someone in your life ever surprised you with growth or change you didn't expect? Have you experienced your own unexpected reconnection? Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another story of transformation and hope. Life's most beautiful chapters often begin after our greatest challenges. Sometimes, like for Sarah, James, and Emma, happiness is just waiting on the other side of forgiveness.